So the recording is starting now, and I'm going to begin by sharing my screen, and away we go. So this particular Shabbat Hagadol Drasha was inspired by a conversation I had last week with one of our members, whose name is Dr. Adam Saunders. So Adam Saunders is a professor at the UBC Sauder School of Business, and his area of study is actually computers and their impact on human experience. And I always ask him, I say, Adam, how far are we from the singularity? You'll find out what the singularity is in a minute. But Adam's conversation with me helped me to understand something very interesting about artificial intelligence and the way in which we experience the Seder. And so here goes. This is my assimilation of these two topics together. The singularity and the Seder. How the displacement of intelligence and its realignment shape the Seder experience. More on the displacement of intelligence as we go through. But first, let's talk about the singularity. The technological singularity, which is also called the singularity, is a hypothetical point in time in which technological growth becomes uncontrollable and irreversible, resulting in unforeseen changes to human civilization. Or in layman's terms, this is when the computers take over. If you've seen the movie The Terminator, so the singularity is kind of like the Terminator. But it's when the critical piece of this is when somebody's computer intelligence is going to displace the human intelligence that we see in our world. And so that is a real fear. And let's just talk for a moment about artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is intelligence demonstrated by machines. And unlike natural intelligence displayed by humans and animals, which involves consciousness and emotionality. And so what happens is if you make something automatic, you are going to, by definition, remove your own sense of humanity from it. Now, my premise is that the most common question asked at any Seder is, unfortunately, when will we eat? And the reason for this is that something about the telling of this story and the use of a book is going to be a displacement of your own humanity and your own intelligence. But what we're going to do is we're going to look at this in a very systematic way, and I'm going to look at a very particular moment in Jewish history that represented an automation event. So there was an automation event that took place in Jewish history, in the Jewish world, 500 years ago. Principally, this took place in Italy and Poland, shortly after the invention of the printing press. So, before we even get into that change and that particular moment, let's just take a look at what the world looked like before that change. Before the 16th century, before Gutenberg put his print onto the Jewish world, how was it that Jews experienced the Seder? Well, from the time of Moses to somewhere around the year 212, 250 of the Common Era, so everything from 1200 BCE to let's say 212, 250, the Seder was an entirely oral exercise. There was no such thing, not even as a written Haggadah. There was only the oral experience. This was an event that by everything that we know was transmitted orally from generation to generation as a living exercise. There was no scenario. How many times have I sat down to do a eulogy and people tell me about how Zayda used to sit there at the Seder and read through the whole Haggadah, and he read so fast, and how great was it that Zayda was able to read through the Haggadah so fast? This is a memory of only 500 years at most, because there was no such thing as reading something so fast. There was no such thing as blazing through the text of the Haggadah, because it was entirely oral. Now, moving forward a little bit, what happens in the year 212? In the year 212, 250, it's not exactly clear when the Mishnah becomes written down. Somewhere between the last generation of the Mishnah and the first generation of the Talmud, does the Mishnah actually become something which is in print. But the Mishnah goes into written form, and that happens once again 250, 212, and we start to have written product, something for us to read from. If you study Arvei Psachim, if you study the tractate of Psachim, you will see that there are parts of the Seder text which come directly out of this tractate of the Talmud. And let's move forward to slightly more modern times. So here I have two examples of Haggadot for you. One is the golden Haggadah which was written and illuminated in Barcelona in 1320. Now currently residing in the British National Library, and it is beautiful Haggadah. And if you were very, very wealthy, you could afford to have such a thing. And so there were maybe some families who had these beautiful illustrated Haggadot, and they were, I would imagine, a rare find. They would probably cost, for most people, like a year's salary. It was a very expensive thing to have such a Haggadah that wasn't so familiar. How would most people have a Haggadah? How would they have the text of the Haggadah? So over here, we have, on the right-hand side, you've seen the green collection Siddur. So this Siddur was recently acquired by the owner of Hobby Lobby, I believe, and it was gifted to the National Library of Israel, or it's on loan to the National Library of Israel. And this is the oldest Siddur that we have in print, and this Siddur was written circa the year 800, and this Siddur has in it, in the back of the Siddur, you will find the text of the Haggadah Shel Pesach. So people would have a Siddur. They probably weren't as large as our Siddurim today, but that's where you would have the text of the Haggadah. Probably at a Seder, if you were lucky enough to own a Siddur, a hand-copied one, not an illuminated one, but a hand-copied one, so you would be very fortunate. Your whoever was your head of household would have that text of the Siddur. But probably more commonly than not, you're going to have the Haggadah still in this time. It's going to be something that people largely memorize. Maybe they remember well, maybe they don't remember well. They have a few understandings of the Haggadah. Just 1 second, just making sure that I mute everyone. Okay. Correct. Thank you for the correction. It is 800 of the Common Era is this Siddur. 800 of the Common Era, 800 BC, 800 CE. Thank you for that correction. Okay, keeping the chat alive for that. Okay, now, when was the first printing of Jewish books? So the first printing of a Haggadah was in Spain in 1482. In 1486, the Sansino family produced a more widely circulated Haggadah. And just for reference purposes, Gutenberg publishes his Bible in 1455. So that's when you start to have first Haggadot. In order to better understand this, though, I want to take a look at the reaction to printing of Jewish books. And so we're going to do a little bit of a quick summary of how Jewish books are printed, and then what's going to be more important to us is the reaction to these books. So the first copies of the Talmud are published in 1520 through 23 by Daniel Bomberg. Now, Daniel Bomberg was not a Jew. He lived in Venice, and he printed many copies of he's actually the first printer to print the Talmudic text with Rashi and Tosfot and the commentaries of the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher ben Yechiel, and Rambam printed in the back. And this is the first time that Jews have this in wide circulation. The Bomberg template more or less becomes the template that is going to be followed by later generations of Jews. The Bomberg enterprise is actually supported by the Pope, and it has been proofread and supervised by the Av Beit Din of Venice, where Daniel Bomberg lives. Bomberg produces a Shas. He also produces Mikrot Gedolot, which is the commentary on the Chumash with Rashi, Tosfos, Rashbam, Rashi's grandsons, many others also contribute to that. Here are just some other folios of the Bamberg printing. On the right, you have Yeshayahu, and on the left, you have the tractate of Sukkah. You have in the middle, you have Yechezkel and Hosea, and you can still find printings of these works, which more or less follow the template that was set out by Bamberg. And just to give you, for a sense of fun, the Bamberg Shas was sold at auction in 2015 for $9.5 million. So this set a record for the single most expensive piece of Judaica ever publicly auctioned. Moving on to some other Jewish books. This is the Prague Haggadah of 1556. I think these things are very beautiful. They're very illustrative, and it was hard for me to limit myself to just a few. But this gives you an idea of books in the middle of the 16th century are being printed, and they're now starting to become more and more accessible to the Jewish community. So our question here is, how did the printing press influence Jewish learning, and by extension, how did it impact the Seder itself? And this, by the way, printing is a printing of the Sansino Talmud. Sansino was another Italian press that put out Jewish books. So our first stop is going to be the Jewish press and Torah study, codes and critics. So I want to just give you a sense of who are some of the players here. The most important player, and I'm going out of chronological order here for a moment, is going to be the Shulchan Aruch, the set table. This is the work of Rabbi Yosef Karo. And Rabbi Yosef Karo's principal work in life is not this book of the set table, but without question, this is going to become, by accident, his most influential book. And it's written in, the Shulchan Aruch is written in 1563 and is published in 1575. And it is printed in Venice. Most of the printing seems to be taking in Venice, and most of the arguing is taking place in Poland. So here I've learned over my experience here, it's good to give people timelines. So here's a timeline. First of all, you have Bamberg, Mikrot Gedolot, Bible and Commentaries, 1517. And we're going to now look at the reactions, and we're going to learn about some rabbis you are almost certainly never heard of. And there's a reason that you have never heard of them. The first two rabbis that I want to talk about are Rabbi Shalom Shachna and Rabbi Jacob Pollack. Unless you are exceedingly learned and you have learned deeply inside the rabbis of this period, you've probably never heard of Rabbi Shalom Shachna and Rabbi Jacob Pollack. The reason is that these rabbis refused to write down anything. Now, we're not talking about printing press. They didn't go to the printing press. We're talking about the fact that they did not ever put something in print, not by hand, not by scribe, not even by note. They would teach with a Talmud open, and they would come to almost no conclusions. Their process of learning was to teach oral Torah. And they wanted to sharpen the minds of their students. They wanted them to be strong in methods of argumentation. They wanted them to be able to be facile with the arguments and the personal exploration of the text. And they felt we'll see a window into their thinking as we go through some of the sources. These two orange lines that come out of them are two figures which are very centrally important to our story, one of which is centrally important to all Jews. The first one is Rabbi Moshe Isserles. Rabbi Moshe Isserles is the Ashkenazic voice ultimately in the Shulchan Aruch. That's why I sent him with a dotted line up to the publishing of the Shulchan Aruch, which happens later in his life. But Rabbi Moshe Isserles is the authoritative word for most of us on Ashkenazic practice. If you read the Shulchan Aruch, the Shulchan Aruch is written by a Sephardic Jew. Rabbi Yosef Karo, essentially his family were part of the exiles from Spain. And so when he writes his book, he doesn't really accommodate Ashkenazic custom. Rabbi Moshe Isserles writes that. But before Rabbi Moshe Isserles ever gets to write a work on the Shulchan Aruch, he publishes another volume. And that volume becomes printed, and that volume elicits an enormous reaction. And the rabbi who comes to argue with him, another feature player in our story tonight, is Rabbi Chaim ben Betzalel, who writes a book called the Vikuach Mayim Chaim, the Argument of Living Water. The names of these books are actually a play on each other. The Torah Chatat is about the cleansing water, and the Mayim Chaim comes with the cleansing water, and it's a whole play on words. Rabbi Chaim ben Betzalel, just to locate him in the rabbinic family tree, his brother is the famous Maharal of Prague. And what is interesting about Rabbi Chaim ben Betzalel and Rabbi Moshe Isserles is that these two are a chavruta. They study at the yeshiva of Rabbi Shalom Shachna. They study together. They're good friends. And we'll see from the actual words that they put before us that they are very, very good friends, and they are going to be individuals that we need to keep our eye on. So I've tried to keep this all. I know there are a lot of names that I've put out there. The ones that right now I only want you to remember 3 names. Rabbi Shalom Shachna, he's the Rebbe, and he never writes a thing. So Shalom Shachna is the Rebbe, he's the teacher, he doesn't write anything, and he doesn't write anything on purpose. Rabbi Moshe Isserles is going to violate that tradition of putting something in print. He's going to be the one who breaks the ice, and he's going to put something in print. And Rabbi Chaim ben Betzalel is then going to follow him with sharp and fierce argumentation. Okay, so let's look at the words of Rabbi Chaim ben Betzalel. This is his work. This is the actual photocopy of the Vikuach Mayim Chayim, the argument of living water, the debate of living water. So, what does he say? So he's going to say, Rishon, Adaber min hasvarim shenitchabru bizmanenu zeh. I'm going to talk about the books that have been printed, that have been collected in our day. Va'er shehem meviim atzelut belimud hasvarim. Incredibly important words. What is he saying about the printed book? He's saying about the printed book that it's a shanda. Why is it a shanda to write Torah books? Because what do Torah books do? They create laziness in the learning of Torah. Right? Belimud hasfarim hakadmonim, of the early books. So if I print a commentary on the Talmud, so that means that the student is not going to really do a good job learning the Talmud, debating the Talmud, looking at the nuances, looking at the potential interpretations, looking at the pilpul, the argumentation back and forth. He's just going to read, and he's going to say, okay, you know what? That guy's really smart. He's got a good idea, but he's not going to undertake it on his own. V'gam, bahem mitrashlim ha'ol ad shenimtzu kerach mikan vekerach mikan. They're essentially going to become lazy until you have, literally it means frozen here and frozen there. It's going to be sort of an ossifying process in the study of Torah. Va'er shekimat efsher shelo yichashlu ha'machabrim b'lishonam v'lachach ein lismok rak al svarim hakadmonim. He says it's impossible that whoever writes a book is not going to make some mistake in his language. And people are going to make mistakes based on his mistake. And the only books that you can really rely on are the early books of the rabbis. So let's just stop here for a moment. And let's identify, put a pin in what the Vikuach Mayim Chaim is saying. Rabbi Chaim ben Betzalel of Friedberg. He's saying that the moment that you print a book, you are necessarily going to make the student lazy. Because when people read, they are digesting, but they're not thinking. And that is what he's afraid of. Now, I'm going to, in a way, just sort of jump to what I want us to think about. And what I want us to think about is the moment that the Haggadah text became a frozen piece, and it became to be something that you recited, you said, you repeated without engaging in it, it was a displacement of intelligence. It put the intelligence in the pages of the book rather than in the burden that sits upon the shoulders of the individual. And that person was now going to turn the Haggadah from an expository event, from a narrative event, from a personal event, to a reading exercise. And this is exactly the criticism that the Vikuach Mayim Chaim is articulating, and his argument against the first printing of a book by the Ramah. Moving forward, I want you to see some other things that he says in this. So he says as follows: just as a person only likes the food that he prepares for himself, in according with his own appetite and taste, not wishing at all to be a guest at another person's table, thus he does not like another person's rulings unless he agrees with that person. All the more so does he not wish to be dependent upon the books of other authors, whom he does not trust, just as a person likes only the food that he prepares for himself, in accordance with his own appetite and taste, and does not aspire to be a guest at their prepared table. Now these words, that the metaphor he's using is not an accidental metaphor. I actually think that the metaphor is a little bit weak, because sometimes if I go to somebody and they're a good cook, it's fantastic. It's very exciting. I'll eat food that I don't normally eat. Variety is the spice of life. Why is he taking this metaphor? He's taking this metaphor because he is taking aim at the Shulchan Aruch, the code of Jewish law. And what he's saying is that there is something very personal about the learning process. There's something that has to be deeply internalized. There's something fundamentally human that needs to be a part of it. And the moment you move it onto the pages of a book, you take your personality out of it, you take your individuality out of it, you take the work that needs to be done in order to make it a living piece of Torah, and you turn it into black and white words on a page. And he is arguing against this codification, this printing of the code of Jewish law, the Shulchan Aruch. And he says, and for that reason, the ancients refrained from writing any special book to lay down custom and halakha to the general public. It is therefore quite surprising that the Rabbi Moses has written a special book and ignored the things that I've just written about. And what is he talking about in terms of the ancients? Who are the ancients who never wrote these books? Well, maybe he's referring to the fact that until I told you the year 212, 250, when the first generation of Amoraim wrote down the Mishnah, there was no printed text. It was a memorized text, and they didn't want to write something down. But likely he's referring to something much more specific. He's referring to the yeshiva that they studied at. Remember, I told you that these two were study partners at the yeshiva of Rabbi Shalom Shachna, right? The two orange lines here are the fact that they were study partners at his yeshiva. And the Vikuach Mayim Chaim is telling us a story. He's telling us, where did this guy get off writing any of these books? Where he was raised, the yeshiva that he was taught in, they didn't write books. And here he says it, black and white. And he says, it certainly could not have escaped Rabbi Isilis that when we studied together, we were chavrusas, he says, in yeshiva of Rabbi Shalom Shachna, and we heard from his lips the classes, and the students pressured the rabbi many times to codify the laws of kashrut, and he refused, and there's no doubt it is because of his aversion to the laziness of that such a summary would produce. It is interesting that in another work, we discover a little bit more about what happened in this particular scenario. This is written by the son of Rabbi Shalom Shachna. And he says as follows. We have no pictures of him, we have no books of his. The best I could do for you is give you a picture of his tombstone. I was taught the practical aspects of halacha by my master and teacher and father, the Gaon. The Gaon means genius, rabbi and luminary of the diaspora, Rabbi Shalom, known as Shochna, of blessed memory. May I be a expiation for his decease. Hareni kaparat mishkavo. I am his atonement. Who taught many pupils from one end of the earth to the other. We are sustained from his mouth, and we drink his waters. And by my very life and soul, many times I requested him, together with many other students, to make a psak, meaning make a halachic ruling. And his answer, offered out of much piety and humility, for he was humbler than any man on the face of the earth, was, I know that if I write such a book, future authorities will rule exclusively as I write. In view of the principle that the law is decided according to the last authority, there's a principle in the Talmud called halacha kibatra. The halacha follows the last opinion.
No.
We generally think, oh, wait a minute. If I'm from a certain generation, I can't argue on an earlier generation. I can't argue on there is such a concept, but there is a dueling concept, and the dueling concept is that the halacha follows the last opinion, because it may be true that in earlier generations they followed one practice, but perhaps for various reasons, pressures of society, changes in let's say even economic context, that the law changes, and the Talmud will tell us that there's this idea of halacha kibatra. The halacha follows the last authority. So Rabbi Shalom Shachna says that is exactly how I analyze the process of learning. I analyze the process of learning by ensuring that the student now studying the law, or the rabbi currently working through the problem, he is the authority. And if I write a book now, it could happen that in 20 years, that rabbi is just going to rely on my analysis, and that he would say is wrong. He didn't want people to rely only on him. And he was referring, for example, to a case where there's controversy among the rabbis, and he would decide between two opinions in the Talmud, or two opinions amongst the medieval authorities. But the judge can base his decision only on what is before him. Therefore, each person should decide according to that particular time as he sees fit. There was actually a case when the students stole the notes of Rabbi Shalom Shachna and tried to copy them down, and he took it away from them, got very angry with them for doing that, because he was a very, very strong proponent of the idea that you don't write books, you rely on the Talmud, you rely on earlier works, Rambam, Tur, works that have already been put pen to paper, and it is your job to look amongst the disputants and to settle the halacha based on how you see it. Because he didn't want it to become that since something was said at a particular time, it becomes fixed forever. He wanted there to be a living engagement with the text. He wanted it to not be an artificial intelligence, if you will. He wanted it to be a living intelligence. And this was the principle of Rabbi Shalom Shachna, the Rebbe, the teacher of Rabbi Moshe Isserles. Okay, now back to our story. Okay, so we've learned about Rabbi Shalom Shachna, Rabbi Moshe Isserles, Rabbi Chaim ben Betzalel, and their arguments. Now it's time for us to learn about another individual. Just covering the timeline now. 1559 is when the Torah Chatat of Rabbi Moshe Isserles comes out. But more important is this date, 1578. 1578, the Shulchan Aruch, he writes the Shulchan Aruch by hand, finishes in 1565. In 1578, that is when the printed edition of the Shulchan Aruch and the glosses of Rabbi Moshe Isserles are printed together. This is an extremely important event, and there are scholars who argue that the Shulchan Aruch would not have been as important a book had Rabbi Moshe Isserles not said, I'm going to make this a book for Ashkenazim and Sephardim. At that point, the Ashkenazic world and the Sephardic world were relatively separate, and they were not sharing ideas between each other. And you didn't always find out, well, this is how the Sephardic rabbis ruled, this is how the Ashkenazic rabbis ruled. And what happens in this particular moment is that Rabbi Moshe Isserles, he stitches together these two traditions, and he makes a single book that is going to be widely used because it has both this fantastic distillation of the conclusions of Rabbi Yosef Karo. And I wish I had more time to talk to you about how Rabbi Yosef Karo came to his conclusions and what his previous works were. His story is a fascinating one all its own, which regrettably I don't really have time to go into. But this publication of the Shulchan Aruch, to this day, it was published in 1578. I will tell you that if a rabbi has a question about spoons and forks and meat and milk and onions and knives and all those things, the book that he turns to is the Shulchan Aruch. It became the authoritative code of Jewish law. It was at that moment that this world, which was very oral, which was very separate, the world of Rabbi Shalom Shachna was a world where every rabbi decided afresh on his own. It was a very rich engagement with Torah from the rabbi's perspective, but you had very different practices. If you went to Lublin, you got one answer. If you went to Krakow, you got another answer. If you went to Friedberg, you got a third answer. The Shulchan Aruch and the mapab, the tablecloth, and the set table of which were the names of the books, the merged book of the Shulchan Aruch became this standard code. It unified practice. It was a very, very useful tool as a Jewish instrument. But at the same time, it was extremely threatening because it essentially set on its edge the entire culture of learning. The culture of learning was oral. It was interactive. It was engaging. It was intensely human. It was intensely something that was made independent and individualistic, and that you required engagement with a rebbe, with a master. Now, if you want to be a great Talmid Chacham, you can just go to the. If you manage to assimilate all of the information in the Shulchan Aruch and the commentaries on the side of the pages, you can be a fantastic Talmid Chacham. If you can decipher all of the issues, you might be able to largely avoid having to go to class, because the book now contains so much. So here's the criticism of Rabbi Shlomo Luria, who lives in Lublin, and is a very, very important figure in his own right. And this is what he writes in the Yam Shel Shlomo, his commentary, which is called the Sea of Shlomo. He says, "I will bring to support to your words, since writing books without end is what the rabbis warned about," meaning he's still trying to hold on. He's trying to preserve this independent tradition. "It is better to listen to the words of the sages and their debates and to engage them and to engrave them on the wall of your heart, so that it does not leave you all of your days. Perhaps you will say, I will fix it all, and all the arguments will become resolved, and the proofs will fall in line, and it will become as a set table." Again, wagging his finger at this book, the Shulchan Aruch. I put them both in orange for you, so you would know that he's referring to that book, and he's saying, you think it's going to be so easy. You think you can just do some kind of very interesting analysis. You'll resolve all of the conflicts, and the halacha will become a set and fixed table. My son, this is not a good happening. I warn you, my son, a second time, even more forcefully, against writing books without end, because by fixing, you will come to corrupt the matter, and gain will evaporate with your loss. He is telling you, we have a problem here. Our problem is that if we write books, we are going to desiccate the learning process. That the way that learning should be done is by sitting yourself at the foot of a sage and understand the debate, engrave it on your heart. The moment you fix it in a book, you are going to send yourself on the wrong path. And then he tells us an interesting story, some paragraphs later. And this is the one which really sent me to... it really caught my eye, and hopefully you will remember this. He's talking about a book of chalitza. Chalitza is the ceremony that has to take place when a woman becomes a widow. Her husband dies. She has no children, and she has a brother-in-law. And nowadays we dissolve the marriage that would potentially exist between them through a ceremony called chalitza. And it's very technical, and you need to make sure you get it right in order to dissolve the marriage. It's as important as writing a kosher get in order to allow this woman to remarry. So he says, with respect to the laws of Chalitza, so there was this book that was written, and I see that people read this book about Chalitza. What do they do with it? He says, I've seen how many do not understand the sources of the matter, but read through the Chalitza like one reads the Haggadah from a Siddur on Passover night. Oh my goodness! Right? We all know that image. He's saying that's the worst way you could come to learn. Read through the words and they don't mean anything to you. You just daven it up, as they sort of say in the yeshivas. You just spit out the words of the Haggadah. This is entirely the wrong way to go about your learning. And the question now is, so okay, what was the impact of the Haggadah on this? So I would say, first of all, we can already see from these words of the Maharal, the Marshal, Rabbi Shlomo Luria, where he says, like, one reads from the Haggadah from a Siddur on Passover night, already in the days of Rabbi Shlomo Luria, right? So Rabbi Shlomo Luria is at the end of, he's at the end of the century. And if you remember when the first Haggadah was printed, so the first Haggadah is printed in 1486. So Rabbi Shlomo Luria on our timeline is about 100 years after that. He's around 1486. He's writing this, and already within 100 years of the printing of the Haggadah, we have evidence that jumps off the page that people just read the Haggadah. They just read it. They don't internalize it. Now, I'm going to use this to contrast the way Maimonides talks about this mitzvah. There is a mitzvah of teaching the night of the Seder. Maimonides says, I have the Hebrew here, but since I think most people are more comfortable in English, I'm going to work off the English, but certainly anybody who wants to tell me that my translation is wrong, I'm happy to take that criticism. We are commanded to tell the story of the Exodus on the night of the 15th of Nisan, at the beginning of the night. According to the lucidity of the narrator, it is to be told. All that which one may add in this telling, and to extend in detail, and in the magnitude of what Hashem did for us, and the abuse the Egyptians visited upon us, of the burden and the theft, of how Hashem brought revenge upon them, and to extend in thanks to Hashem, may His name be blessed, for the kindness will be a greater execution of the mitzvah. As it says, Kol ha'marbe l'saper harei meshubach. All who expand the telling, this is to be praised. This does not sound like someone is reading from a book. This is somebody acting it out. This is somebody completely engaging, trying to tell a compelling story with details and suspense and magnitude and extending details. This is not, oh my gosh, how many more pages do we have? Right? When the Rambam describes this mitzvah, it is not the mitzvah of reading a book so you get every word in. It is the mitzvah of being emotionally engaged in something. He does not want you to displace your humanity into the pages of the Haggadah. Rather, he wants you to use the Haggadah as the floor of the event. The Haggadah is a reference point, if you will, but everything else has to be emotion, personality, detail, extension. When you read Rabbi Soloveitchik's Rabbi Soloveitchik used to give memorial lectures for his father, Rabbi Moshe Soloveitchik, and they're printed in a book called Shiurim Lezecher Abba Mori, Lessons in the Memory of My Father of Blessed Memory. So in one, he has a discussion about the Seder and how one is meant to do this. And he says, one is obligated to perform a Seder that testifies to one's great fortune and happiness, and to demonstrate the unrestrained and unfiltered feelings of elation and excitement. To do this as if you were there just now, the beneficiary of this great miracle, and as if you, just now, were released from Egypt, and from the mud and the bricks to the great light of freedom and Torah. In other words, you are a witness to the Exodus and to the events that you now recount did not happen to a third party, but to yourself. You're obligated to do more than just verbalize. You must also embody the Haggadah, give expression to your joy and excitement through action and deed. I heard today, I can't verify it, that Rabbi Soloveitchik's grandfather used to walk into the Seder wearing a pot on his head. And that was to literally let people know that this was a different night. But Rabbi Soloveitchik is telling you, you have to actually tell a story. You've got to get into it. You've got to, you completely immerse yourself. This is a highly human thing. And the idea that you would read a text to do this seems exceedingly far from what Rabbi Soloveitchik and Rambam are describing. So I wanted to try as best as I could to sort of not just talk about what this is, but sort of illustrate how this may have happened. And so I want to give you a couple of illustrations of what innovation looked like in the telling of the story of the Exodus, based on how the Haggadah gets put together. So we could sort of ask this question by saying, well, what's the first section of the Haggadah that's not found in the Talmud? And the answer is that it's the halach ma'anya. This is the bread of affliction. We know that this was introduced to the Haggadah in the time of Rabbi Sadia Gaon, or perhaps earlier, but the first time we have it in print is in the Sidurim of the Gaonim. The text I have for you here is one of our earliest sources, if not the earliest source for it, is the Sidur of Rav Amram Gaon. And he has this text called the Halach Ma'anya. And so the question is, why do they need to put this in? There's a lot about matzah in the Seder. We're going to say the Manishtana in a minute. Why is this night different from all other nights? Why is there this moment where you have to make this statement, this is the bread of affliction? And I think this is an example that they felt very much that there were two things that need to be injected into the Seder to make it a very personal experience. Number one, they have to say that this is poor man's bread. They needed a text that was going to allow them to say, we are poor. We are poor, even though it took enormous amounts of energy and resource in order to put on a Seder, even going back, this is now 1,200 years ago. And so when they do this, they had to have been thinking, okay, there needs to be a jump start here. We need to be able to make it look like we really are poor. So they throw a text into the Haggadah. They throw it into the Haggadah, not in the vernacular. Not in Hebrew, but in the vernacular, in the language of the street, so that people say, tonight I feel like a poor man. You have to start the Seder in the mindset of someone who's poor. This was their example. It shows us that had to be introduced. It showed us that the Haggadah experience wasn't strong enough at this point. There had to be something that was done to infuse, to turn up the volume on the sense of poverty at the beginning. Furthermore, they also wanted to stress the concept of guests at the Seder. And last but not least, they wanted you to know that the Seder is headed towards Jerusalem. I heard someone today say something interesting. They said that Shimon Peres said that to be what the Jews gave to the world was a sense of dissatisfaction. And he said that was their gift. And I think that there's some truth to that. The idea that we of Jews, we are Hashem's partner, the idea that we're fixing the world means that we are identifying things about which we are dissatisfied. And so if we are not yet in Israel, that is a issue of dissatisfaction, and we put it into the Haggadah, and we point in that direction. But you can see that how the Babylonian Jewish community, they felt the need to turn up the volume on poverty. They felt the need to turn up the volume on the importance of guests in their Seder. And they need to turn up the volume on the fact that we are not yet in Jerusalem. So that's example number one. Example number two, I think, is also very interesting. Example number two is the Vehisha Amda. Or actually, I'm going to focus more on this part. My father was a wandering Aramean. So first, let's just lay one thing out there. The Talmud tells you that you are meant to start the story from my father was a wandering Aramean until you complete the entire parsha. Now this parsha, the parsha that the Mishnah tells us, the rabbis of the Mishnaic era, the Talmudic era, tell us that we're meant to use to tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt, that we have no choice about. This is our obligation. We must do that. Is from the words, my father, Arami Oved Avi. I'm not going to translate that. Arami means an Aramean. Oved is a hard word to translate. Avi means my father. So Arami, hard word to translate, my father. When you look at this in your Haggadah, it will almost always be translated, an Aramean tried to destroy my father, as a transitive verb. And then the Haggadah will also includes this idea that in every generation they rise up against us to destroy us. And then we say, come and learn. What did Lavan the Aramean try to do to destroy our forefather Jacob? What I want to tell you is that the idea of Lavan trying to destroy Yaakov is something that was inserted into the Haggadah after the period of the Mishnah, after the period of the rabbis of the Talmud. How can I prove that? I can prove that to you because when you go back to the original text, which is found in the Midrash Tanaim, which you have right here, these are photocopies of the David Tzvi Hoffman version of this, and I'm just going to point out to you just a couple of lines on this that shows you exactly what we're talking about. So he says, the Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman says as follows. He says, Melamed shelo halach avinu Yaakov la'aram ela amanat la'abed min ha'olam. That we learn that our father Jacob did not go to Aram except to remove himself from the world. Why did he go to Aram? So the Midrash is saying he was in such despair. He wanted to leave the world. Arami Oved Avi means my forefather, the Aramean, Jacob, tried to destroy himself. And Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman says, HaSifri einu mefarish d'Arami hu Lavan. He says the Sifri says the Arami is not Lavan. Arami hu Yaakov Avinu. It's Yaakov. V'nikra Arami Oved al shahalach la'aram. He destroyed himself by going into Galut, by going into the exile, to Aram Naharaim, to this place. V'haya sham b'sakana la'abed min olam. And he was in danger because the exile put him in danger of disappearing from the entire world. Who made himself in danger? That was our forefather Jacob. The original version of this was different than the way our current Haggadah presents it. The original version of it was about the fact that Yaakov went to a place where he would be assimilated, he would be lost. But the version of the Haggadah that we have now is about the fact that Lavan tried to destroy us. I'm not trying to suggest one reading is good or bad. They're both very valid readings. But what you see here is that at a certain period in time, when looking at this particular discussion, a group of rabbis, of expert narrators said, you know what? What are we feeling now? We're feeling the hand of the anti-Semites pushing down on us. Maybe they were living, this was inserted in the Gaonic times, maybe they were living in Babylonia. Maybe they were feeling that the Aramean or the descendants of those Arameans were the ones who were really destroying them. Well, they can't say that, cursed be the Babylonians. The things would get a little too heated. So they say, okay, in every generation there were people trying to destroy us, and they put this oblique reference to Lavan the Aramean who lived so far back nobody could remember. But the emotion there could be, guess what? Today we're fighting the same battles that our forefathers fought. It is V'hisha amda lavotenu v'lanu. In every generation God has stood for us. And we're in another generation. Yes, it's true that our forefathers were oppressed in Egypt. But you know what our today's oppression is? Our today's oppression are maybe the current Babylonians trying to give us some trouble. You see that they brought something highly personal that was very much in their own context into the Seder. And I want to just add one little point here that I thought was a very, very powerful idea. This doesn't come from the Seder, but rather comes from writing of one of the great Hasidic masters, Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Leib of Gur, the Ger Rebbe. And he says, last week's parsha, he says, Adam ki akriv mikem, a man who from you brings a sacrifice. Hapashut liten mipnimiyut kochov rutzono l'Hashem yitbarach. You have to give from your innermost self, your inner personality. You must give that to Hashem. Batel ratzoncha. Minimize your own personal desires. V'hu b'chinat karban lekarev kol hamasim l'Hashem yitbarach. Give your actions to Hashem. Ki mikem k'ma shekatuv. Avi Ezrizal, my father, my teacher, may be of blessed memory. Perish HaMishnah im ein anili. If I am not for myself, what does that mean? So he says, Shagam kol echad yitain inyan shelo. You have to give yourself. Yeach nasat atzmo betoch klal Yisrael. There is some special gift that you have. There is some special part of your neshama, of your soul, of your personality that is needed for the totality of Israel, and you must insert that into the narrative. This must be part of your personal religious service. It is not meant to blot out your individuality, but it is meant to rather harness it, to find it, in such a way that you can give it back. So I wanted to be a little more practical about this so that you can understand. There are three kinds of additions that you can make to your story. One of them is, starting from the right, what slavery looked like then and now. If you want to make the story more engaging, you can bring, Egyptian hieroglyphics. You can tell them what it was like to make bricks in the Nile Delta. There are some interesting videos even on YouTube. Don't use the videos on Yom Tov, but you can use them beforehand, that show what it's like to be an Egyptian brickmaker. There are papyrus that will tell you that the brickmaker was only allowed to bathe once a year. And when you take a look at the video and you marry it with the papyrus, you'll realize that is the dirtiest possible work. If you want to, you can tell about you can bring the idea of slavery alive by talking about human trafficking today. There are countless stories about the abuses of slavery. There are countless ones in the Midrash. There are countless ones in archaeology. Those are all wonderful. You can also use elaborations from tradition. There are many Haggadot, from Abraham Twersky to the one that I have pictured here is Rabbeinu Tzadok HaKohen of Lublin. There are the Netziv wrote a Haggadah. There's the Haggadah of the Gadol Yisrael. There are probably more Haggadot than any other book ever printed. I would only say to you that if you are using those kinds of traditional Haggadot, and you're in, we'll call it mixed company, meaning some yeshiva students, some not yeshiva students, no yeshiva students, people with little background, don't deliver the full derivation. Deliver the emotional outcome. Distill the message. Make it your own. Make it emotive. Make it exciting. Make it dynamic. Use the traditional source, but then make it dynamic. And the last one, I think, looks like the least from, but I think it's really the most from. And the last one is elaborations from the miracle of your personal story, your personal family story. When I showed you that picture of the story of Lavan the Aramean, that really there was a version that version of the story is entirely different, but they must have felt some pressure of what was going on in their own day, and they wanted to include in the telling of the Passover story their own family story. It is about, part of the idea of Pesach is not only a political concept of we were once slaves and we are now free. There's a very strong concept, even the name of the holiday. The name of the holiday means the destructive force that God visited upon the world passed over my house. I was saved. I was spared. And one thing I can tell you that is true of every single person listening here, is that there were 1,000 brick walls and snares and traps and ambushes and anti-Semites and genocidal maniacs that stood between Moses at Sinai and your presence at a Seder today. And that story, that miracle, is part of what you have to celebrate on Seder night. When we go back to listen to what Rabbi Soloveitchik said, he says, it talks about to do this as if you were just now the beneficiary of this great miracle. Right? In other words, you are witness to the Exodus and the events that you now recount. It didn't happen to a third party. You have to embody the Haggadah. You have to feel it. Rabbi Chaim of Tzanz, right? This is no left-winger. Rabbi Chaim of Tzanz is Tzanzer Rav. He was a Hasidic Rebbe. He used to tell the story of his escape from the Holocaust at the Seder. And that was the only time he talked about it. Because he felt that that's part of what you do. So there are ways to tell this story. And so if I go back to the original premise, the original premise is, when I had this conversation with Adam Saunders about artificial intelligence, I asked him, are we closer to the singularity or are we farther from the singularity? And Adam said, well, look, it cuts in both directions. Last March, the entire world leapt forward 5 years in 4 weeks. All sorts of things became automated that were never automated before. I will tell you, just as an example, I like throwing this out there, I became a Canadian citizen sitting at this desk. I took my oath of citizenship here because Canada had to figure out how to make its citizens without putting you in a room and exposing you to corona. It would be a really cruel joke to say, thank you, I'm now a citizen of Canada, but I have to check into the intensive care unit. So it fast forwarded. Everything got automated very, very quickly. And we all learned to use Zoom, and we all learned how to do business remotely, and we let machines do a lot more work for us. But Adam said something else which was interesting. He said, but we also realized how much more we need each other and how much more we need the connection to each other. And I realized that is the story of the printed Haggadah. The printed Haggadah, I believe, I don't want to disparage it. It's necessary. We live in a world, you can't get rid of the machines, you can't get rid of the printed Haggadah. But it worked against us. It worked against us because it turned what was supposed to be an emotional, demonstrative, theatrical, dramatic, personal, expressive experience into something that got davened up, that you just read. And that is, I think, the story that I'm trying to tell. I wanted to show you the story of how the Shulchan Aruch and the publication of these works was vociferously argued against by the rabbis of its day, because the rabbis of its day said, you are going to stop the debate of the Torah. You're going to stop the personalization. You're going to stop the hard intellectual work. You're going to stop the wrestling with the concepts, and you're just going to make it into a distilled, settled matter, and you're going to desiccate it. And that, to a certain extent, we saw even from the words of the Maharal, that's what happened. Like one reads the Haggadah from a Siddur on Passover night, and it was a sort of a kvetch. The Haggadah became the butt of the joke. And so I think it is our job to avoid the Haggadah singularity. Also, similarly, the Pesach singularity is a hypothetical point in time at which the printed text of the Haggadah becomes insurmountable, and that all human emotions becomes expunged from the telling of the Exodus, resulting in a boring experience that features a single curiosity. When will we eat? You need to avoid the Haggadah singularity at all costs. Okay, so I am happy to take questions, comments, thoughts, suggestions for the Haggadah.
Question.
Sure.
The Haggadah, both the Rambam and the Maharal speak about Yetziat Mitzrayim. Hare kol hamarbe b'tzat Mitzrayim ze mishubach. And now, of course, it's lengthened beyond, and that's why people probably lose their time and so on. They don't want to continue the Hallel and all the other things that they've added on.
Excellent. Okay, so 2 points on that. Point number one is that what I would suggest is on our website we have this sort of I forget what it's called. It's a Haggadah primer, something like that. I actually, maybe I'll go there and find it right now. But it tells you which parts of the Seder you absolutely must say, which are nice, and which you can avoid. Let me see if I can find it so that people can see what I'm talking about. Actually, let me just give me 1 second to pull it up. The second thing I'll say while I'm pulling that up is something which I think is very interesting as well. And that is that I was listening to a podcast today. There's someone who just wrote a book called The Telling about the Passover Seder. And I'm not sure I agree with everything, but he said something very interesting. He said that neuropsychologically, people have come to understand that you remember things that are associated with food and with music. And so the idea is that you want to make sure that you have enough music and enough food-related telling of the story to mix in. Yeah, you guys are the conductors, and there's going to have to be balance. So, okay, I found all right, I'm going to walk you through the Shaare Zedek webpage. Here we go. So Shaare Zedek homepage. So there is right here, this is the homepage. If you scroll down, Pesach information. And on the Pesach information, it says, there's a tab that says how to run your Seder. This document right here has a little chart for the sections. They're numbered in terms of 1, 2, 3. 1 is of utmost importance. One who skips may not properly fulfill the mitzvah of the Seder. Don't skip any ones. 2, a feature of the Seder that by custom we've come to embrace, but it's not strictly required. Best example is Dayenu. Who would skip Dayenu with their Seder? But if you did, it's a kosher Seder. And the number 3s are they're a staple element of the text, but they're not absolutely, if you omit them, you very much have a kosher Seder. And they're not usually the things that people are most attached to. So a good example of that is the story about other people's Seders. Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and their Seders, you don't have to say those. So this is a handy guide printed out before Yom Tov. Sit down, plan out your Seder, make sure you know which stories you're going to tell. Make sure that you set up good stage directions. That would be my suggestion for that.
I've got a question.
Sure.
Normally we follow our customs. So if it is your custom to plow through the Haggadah, are you now advising against that?
Well, yes, I would. I would very much plow. Look, there are customs which are sometimes born out of error, and I would say plowing through the Haggadah, it is so important to make this an emotional experience. It's so important that I would say absolutely do not plow. Engage people, interest them, try and let them appreciate what this story is about, how the story is personal. I really believe that when you read Rabbi Soloveitchik, when you read Maimonides about how you're supposed to do the Seder, you have to be constructive. You have to be creative. You have to dress up if you need to. Get sock puppets. If you have older kids, then you might need to print out pictures of what slavery looks like. You might need to draw on their Haggadahs with stories from various parts of Jewish history and Jewish tradition, which can be quite emotive. The idea of these rabbis is not that the books were bad. It's that the books supplanted the hard emotional work that was necessary to really make this a successful event.
The Haggadah in our customs, since we're talking about customs, we would read it both chanted in Hebrew and chanted again in Arabic. And the Dayenu is a very, very long one. Rather than 15 stanzas and so on, it's a very long Dayenu.
Okay, so
both
I don't
Arabic
want
and Hebrew.
I don't want to chas v'shalom, I should take away from anybody's customs. Sometimes those customs are important in and of themselves. And the Sephardim, I think the Sephardim may have some more interesting and better customs than the Ashkenazim. The idea that I think Rabbi Gabai talked about, you bring the bihilu, and the back and forth that you have when you ask where you're coming from, where you're going to. There's some wonderful things in the Sephardic tradition, and the idea that you like. I don't want to come to. I'm going to let everybody be the editor of their own traditions, and maybe if you want to do a few verses in Hebrew and a few verses in Arabic, to preserve that. I don't want to come and tell people not to do that, because part of the beauty of the Haggadah, part of the story, is the traditions we picked up along the way. Part of the story, Tony, for your family, the idea that your family escaped, the massacres that took place in Baghdad, is to me part of your Pesach story. I wouldn't want that to be excised from anybody's Pesach. I think that story has to be told. I think, where else are you going to have an opportunity to tell the next generation that the wealthiest Jew in Baghdad was hung in the middle of the street in a riot? I think these are very important things to preserve and to tell and to be part of our story, because, like I said, there were 1,000 ambushes, and there were 1,000 brick walls, and there were 1,000 reasons why we didn't have to be here. And so I think you have to think of yourself as the chef in the soup. Not too much salt, not too much water. You got to figure out that balance. I have to leave it to you. Any other?
Where is the section in the website?
Okay, so once again, I'll walk through it one more time. Okay. If you go, start at the home screen. This is the home screen for Sha'ar Tzedek. There is Pesach information, and then it is how to run your Seder, and that's where you get to it.
Thank you.
Okay. So thank you all for participating. I'm sorry that we're not able to be together. I would love to get emails from you, comments to you, how you're telling the story, how you're making it exciting, how you're making it interesting, how you're bringing your own emotion to it, how you're going to bring the story alive. And there are many, many, many ways to do it. Unfortunately, I didn't have time to catalog all of them. So Chag Sameach to all, and just a reminder, tomorrow morning, 7:15 is my siyum, 8 o'clock is Rabbi Gabai's siyum. Please make sure you register for the sale of chametz before 11 a.m. on Friday. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to message me. Chag Sameach to all.
Chag Sameach. Thank you.
Yasher Koach, Rabbi.
Thank
Chag Sameach.
you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Very informative, different.
Chag Sameach, Rabbi. Thank you.
Chag Sameach.